Howdy ho, everyone. How you doing today? This is Carpo coming at you from the front yard again, and it's a somewhat mild day here in Portland. Come outside and feel the air and smell the spring, and make a video about seeing and smelling and feeling. Basically, I wanted to somewhat try to tackle the idea of senses here. Now, it's funny because I've wanted to make a video talking about this probably a dozen times, but it's usually when I'm in a state of mind where, let's just say, I'm not exactly straight. In states of mind where maybe I've had a strong psychedelic experience or disassociation to where I all of a sudden realize how important our senses are and what life is really about as a human. And then all of a sudden that full revelation just kind of fades away, and I think there's no way I can explain this. I could sit and make a video about it, but I'm going to do my best anyway. What I've realized through many of my experiences, and I'm namely talking about psychedelic journeys or disassociative experiences where I'm on the verge of, let's just say, reality. I don't pursue those experiences in order to get high, or to escape anything, but rather to find those little bits of knowledge that are lost in our day-to-day life, but that tend to surface when we're in extreme situations. And I can give you an example of where I'm coming from here. When people have a near-death experience or get themselves, in a situation where they're very in danger and their blood's pumping, and you hear the story of their life flashing before their eyes. And people will tell you, no, it's a very literal thing. All these events happen, but it just seems to happen in a split second. And in that moment, time can kind of slow down. People can come back from near-death experiences or, life-changing moments with a newfound understanding of life because they're somewhat reborn after seeing things differently in a different state of mind because they were there. Difficult to express, but the same way in a psychedelic experience, which is what they call the ego death. And I wanted to make a separate video about this, and I probably will, but it seems the ego death, that term is thrown around as if it means that you just take psychedelics and then you eliminate your ego through some awareness. And it doesn't work that way at all. Ego is part of who we are. It's integral to us. What it means is that when you've let down your guard and you've eliminated who you are for a moment, the very important things tend to come to the surface, and they bubble forth, and the froth floats to the top, and you start to think, oh, so all that really matters are my senses. To be able to smell, to touch, to taste, to feel, and to hear sounds. And it doesn't mean that you have to have all your senses at all. We know, when I was younger, I used to think, oh God, it would be horrible to be blind or be deaf. And sure, it would be for a bit, if you'd already heard or seen before that. But eventually you'd accustom to yourself to it, as long as your mind was ready to accept that. And your other senses would begin to become more prominent, let's just say. And you can hear better if you can't see, for example. And this is your brain compensating for the loss. But those senses that we have, when one of them's gone, is one thing. But when you have synesthesia, which is when your senses get mixed up, it is a phenomenal experience. It's where you look at a color and you can hear the sound of it. Or you can smell colors, or hear colors. Or when you hear a song, it washes through you and you can feel it physically as the notes hit. It's a very intense experience, and it's one that makes you realize what makes us us. And all of this that I'm talking about here, I guess the reason why I find it important is because I feel like humans are so attached to life. And not just this life, but we're attached to an afterlife. We want to know that when we go, we're going to go somewhere else, and that, we'll be able to continue on with our own current understanding. And what I've realized about senses is that when we're young, we're babies, all of those senses are there, but they're still fresh, and we haven't learned how to assimilate them into our lives. eventually we can learn to shut out certain senses, selective hearing, or we can delude ourselves to the point where we can see actual hallucinations, actual visual hallucinations of people in front of us that aren't really there. With the remain, everything around it is just totally normal, not in a hallucinatory sense like a psychedelic. And it was fascinating because I read a book called it's called Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks. He died a few years back, but he was a phenomenal researcher, and he also wrote a book called Musicophilia. And both of them, one dealt with just hallucinations in general and certain disorders, and the other one was about music, or rather audio hallucinations. People who wake up every day and have a song going through their head, but it's not like you're just hearing it in the back of your head, like you can think right now and hear a song in your head. It's as if these people are walking through life with an actual soundtrack playing all the time for them. And they learn to compensate and deal with it. They learn to acclimate. These are people who, and the same with the visual hallucinations. Or smell, of course, is a huge one. People have certain smells when they're ill or sick. But they can still function. And what that leads me to believe is that people learn how to function without their senses. But when you lose your senses, all of them, what remains? What is the you that exists without your senses? Is it just consciousness? And what is consciousness based on? Is it based on senses? And I hope I'm making sense here, but the consciousness that we have and the awareness, how can we separate it from the senses that we use to understand the world around us to develop a consciousness? In other words, being aware of something requires that you are aware of it. That means that if you're aware of a tree, you either see it, or you might hear it blowing in the breeze, but you're not conscious of it unless there is some part of you in the human sense that can see it. So, without your eyeballs, what do you really see? I mean, when people talk about disembodied consciousness, I mean, anything's possible. But if you saw in color, for example, why would you see in color? Why wouldn't you see in infrared? Why wouldn't you see in ultraviolet? Like some animals see. And all of this kind of leads me to an understanding that it doesn't really matter what might happen afterwards. Because these senses that we have right now, and I'm talking afterlife, everyone has their own opinion. Some people yearn for understanding of that. But to me, I realize that all I have right now to make this consciousness are these senses. And while we're talking about senses, the most fascinating thing, most people would think that science is pretty well settled on a lot of these subjects, right? And make sure the camera's going. As far as how our senses work. For example, we know that we feel because we have nerves in our skin, right? And we know that we can see because we have rods and cones in our eyes that adjust, and a pupil that opens and closes according to the light. It's just like an aperture camera. We know that we hear because our eardrums vibrate and those frequencies are translated into information, even though that's still not quite 100% known exactly how our brains translate it, and probably won't be. They pretty much understand how our senses work, except for smell. And it's funny because science will always tell you when they know something, but scientists rarely talk about the things they don't know because, well, they leave that to the philosophers, and then make fun of them when they have theories on it that they can't prove. But smell is something different. Now, you would think if you smell something, then these little particles of whatever you're smelling enter your nose and allow you to smell. And you wouldn't be wrong. The question is, when these particles enter your nose, these molecules, how do they interact with your nose? Now, you've got thousands of these, smell receptors. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think you can smell like 10,000 different smells or something. I think they said we only have like 400 smell receptors, if I'm not mistaken. And they're kind of in this like pattern, and they believe that when a molecule enters, or a certain smell, or group of molecules, they'll trigger certain parts of this, they'll fit like keys to a lock, theory, that will trigger your brain to, oh, that's that smell. But it doesn't, it's very difficult to explain because I don't even understand it, but the idea that when we smell something, that you would think that the molecule itself would determine it, but there's stereo isomers, they call them, which are basically molecules that look identical but are backwards. And they've been doing experiments with molecules that look very similar to each other, thinking they should have the similar smells if it's a key and lock mechanism, but they end up being totally different. So what I'm getting at is that human smell is based on something probably very unique compared to, let's say, the way that other animals smell. Like not all animals. I'm saying a lot of animals share that same sense of smell with humans, but some of them have a much greater smell, and some of them, for example, sharks, they have it's like a molecular reaction. They can smell blood in the water from so far away. But all creatures deal with smell differently. For example, humans see color, but we only see three colors. Animals see in infrared. Snakes, they can see heat, and that's how they strike. And then you have bees, which see ultraviolet. So when you pick up a flower and you look at it, even if it's a totally white flower, that's not what a bee sees. They might see stripes that look like runways to them. Seriously, if you look at UV light shown on flowers and the way that a bee sees, it's pretty amazing. Some of these flowers that just look very plain as day to us are like targets to these guys. So this is just what we know. So these are different senses for different creatures that are able to process things differently. So what makes us us, and part of our ego, and part of ourselves, are our senses. And how do we separate ourselves from our senses and picture ourselves as a disembodied consciousness in heaven, if you will? And I hate to turn this from just like a senses thing into a philosophy about heaven, but it's the idea that it's not. A lot of people say things like that because they want to make fun of those who believe in an afterlife or to dismiss it. For me, it's not that. It's to say that it doesn't matter so much. In other words, people don't have to fear death. They don't have to fear the unknown. But we do. We're humans. I thought I'd come over here, and I've got these bulbs that I brought home from a job site a few years ago. I was building this house with some peeps and brought home a bunch of little bulbs from out in the front yard since we were remodeling it, and they were just digging up out front. And now we've got these big, beautiful flowers coming up. Sweet. I love flowers. I was looking at these dogwoods over here, and so many beautiful plants, so many different types of flowers. And so many different types of pollinators. How can you not be fascinated by how nature works? It's just like a little tee-hee-hee. I think that the ambulance adds a certain ambiance. I would call it ambulance ambiance, right? I'll leave it at that.